Good afternoon, and thanks for joining me and thinking a little bit about the phenomenon that we now know as empire. I have culled some ideas from my research and my writing, and I would like to present empire today as actually a pervasive, acute, and chronic source of homelessness. So, without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you. Men, women, and children were displaced, dispossessed, and dispersed for centuries. We have inherited a world with similar conditions and with our own avatars of refugee and immigrant crisis. But these phenomena have always been far harder on women. We don't typically think of empire, that economic and political system of the last 500 odd years that has given us our world, as having anything to do with homelessness. It seems much more logical to think of the world system known as imperialism as made of prosperous, shining European metropolises on the one hand, and vast swaths of squalor, despair, and misery in their colonies on the other hand. Today, though, I invite you to think about empire as homelessness of both a chronic kind and an acute kind. Our world seems to be extraordinarily on the move. There are voluntary and involuntary migrant labor, refugees, political asylum seekers, multiple diasporas, crisscrossing the skies and land, and of course, goods and money moving at previously unimaginable speeds. These migrations and movements may seem like very modern things then, but I want us to rethink that a little. Most of what I say next will refer to the British Empire, ruled by Queen Victoria for a great deal of this time, but some of it is applicable to other empires, including this American one. Empires cannot be run without bodies. Let's take India and Britain, a colonial relationship that lasted approximately 350 years. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter for founding the British East India Company. The company then sent envoys to the courts of the great Mughals. These envoys began the process of transforming a somewhat supplicant trading relationship to one of brutal foreign control within 100 years or so. Most of these early visitors, envoys, ambassadors, merchants, ship's crew, went back home on a regular basis. India wasn't yet a settlement, but by the mid-18th century, boatloads of British men began arriving in India to staff the empire and staying for long periods of time. Thus was empire created by the sinews of a large number of men who created the thing called the Raj. Some went back, some died, and some chose to stay back. This last group, called Nawabs, a moniker derived from Indian princes called Nawabs. Such Englishmen seem to have liked their tropical lifestyles and women better than cold, dark England. But in the 19th century, another wave of migrant laborers arrived, the so-called fishing fleets. I call them migrant laborers, for they too arrived in the interests of building and maintaining the empire. These were British women of marriageable age who arrived in India looking for suitable husbands, among British men now being discouraged from cohabiting with native Indian women as demeaning and demoralizing for the empire. The work of these Mem Sahibs was never done. You could call them working women. Their job was to reproduce England. They domesticated the straying nabob and made England respectable while reproducing English children and Englishness among the heathens. But many of them pined for England and never could settle down or embrace their new homes. Racism grows out of such disappointment and rage. Even at this late period, some Englishmen missed the mark altogether and went native, becoming tragic outsiders in both Anglo and Indian society. Around the same time, because slavery had officially ended, the British sent ships full of poor Indian laborers to the Caribbean, Africa, and Polynesia to work there as bonded or indentured labor, which is mostly another name for slavery. Besides the ones that ended up in the ocean, this diaspora is now large, established, and remembers India as a home long lost. So far, I have described the chronic homelessness that empire created. Now I want to look at an acute movement or moment in the history of homelessness in the British Empire. In 1947, at India's independence, a hapless British bureaucrat named Cyril Radcliffe drew a line across northern India, separating it into Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. This is the event known as the Partition of India. Writers have chronicled this birth of a nation followed by the newborn's dissection in tragic, tragicomic, or bitter satirical form. Muslims in India fled to Pakistan, and Hindus in what was now Pakistan fled to India. In this movement, at least 2 million people were killed in rioting and communally inspired genocide. Neighbors had been told by Cyril Radcliffe's line that they were now mortal enemies, so driven mad by despair and loss, they turned on each other. One particular group among these people, however, experienced a homelessness like no other. The women on both sides experienced the last huzzah of empire as a final flourish of eviction and acute homelessness caused by empire even on its deathbed. It was a time like no other. Not only did women experience a disproportionate amount of violence in the form of brutal killings and rape, they were also abducted and held by men of the opposite faith. Their families fled without them in such cases, and sometimes these women had no choice but to assimilate into their abductors' families and even have children with their rapists and abductors and live out their lives in that state. In other cases, they simply vanished after they went missing. However, to make things worse, a year after this genocidal and femicidal event, the governments of India and Pakistan mutually instated the Abducted Persons Recovery and Restoration Act. Now, government workers went door to door looking for women who had been abducted and offered to return them to their natal families. Most such women refused. In other cases, their natal families refused to take them back because their virtue had been soiled by the enemy of their faith, or they had borne children of rape. The feminist scholarship that emerged only in the 90s about this forgotten chapter in women's history characterizes the next 50 years as a deafening silence. Most women who had been captured, raped, and stayed back with their abductor refused to speak of their experience, and many never did. In recent years, this acute moment of empire's homelessness chronicle has begun to be represented, breaking the silence. One novel titled Cracking India powerfully evokes the event itself and the consequences for an innocent nanny or ayah who vanished in this maelstrom.
डेविड मेसी। ओहो, पादरी ने इसकी बेटी की शादी एक बौने से करवाई थी। काली बुद्धि वाला जेंटलमैन बन गया मिस्टर चूड़ा डेविड मसी। और अब ये इंग्लैंड जाएगा और मेम से शादी करेगा। और वो हिंदू लड़की वो आया, संधू आया को बाहर। वो चली गई है। ओए कहीं नहीं गई है वो। क्या नाम है? लॉर्ड छट गई है। झूठ बोलता है ये। झूठ बोलता है। ओए इमाम दीन झूठ क्यों बोलता है? मुसलमानों का तू। अल्लाह की कसम। अल्लाह की कसम। अल्लाह ताला का नाम है, ये अपनी गंदी जुबान न। ओए तू तो कसम खाने को तैयार ही नहीं है। झूठा साला। खाएगा ये कसम? इसका ईमान सच्चा होता तो कसम खाता है ये। खा अल्लाह की कसम। खा अल्लाह की कसम। अल्लाह की कसम खाना। चली गई है। हटो यहाँ से, हटो। सब क्या हो रहा है? क्या हो रहा है ये? हाँ? क्या तमाशा लगा रखा है? चलो तुम यहाँ से, निकलो। ठीक है भाई। डरो मत लेनी बेबी, मैं आ गया। मुझे मालूम है किस चीज से लेनी बेबी के चेहरे पर मुस्कुराहट आएगी। केसरी। लेनी बेबी, मुझे बताओ आया कहाँ है? मैं उसके लिए आया हूँ। वो यही है ना? तुम जानती हो मैं उसके लिए कुछ भी कर सकता हूँ। अंदर मम्मी की बेडरूम में। अंदर है आइस कैंडी वाला, मैं झूठ बोल रही हूँ। वो झूठ बोल रही हूँ। वो अमृतसर चली गई। मैं झूठ बोल रही हूँ। वो अमृतसर चली गई। मैं झूठ बोल रही हूँ। अमृतसर चली गई।
Another film titled Khamosh Pani, meaning silent waters, depicts the self-silencing of a woman abducted into a Muslim family in Pakistan. Confronted with her son's demands to know the truth about her past, she repeats a difficult self-erasure. These are just a few of the images of this female homelessness and suffering created by empire. The British prided themselves on bringing the railways to India. A brutal irony here is that trains became some of the worst killing fields during the migrations of partition. I'd like to read here a section related to this from my recently published novel, Love's Garden, which is about women's struggles against patriarchy within empire. It's the carnage that confronts a woman who's also lost her home and is forced to travel during the massacres. She steps off the compartment and walks a few paces. She sees a pile of what looks like abandoned luggage, sacks, bundles around a pillar, and despairs. Is there a coolie strike then? What will she do now? Her 2 suitcases contain all her worldly possessions, and they are too heavy for her to carry. She must find a coolie. She walks, sourly but doggedly sore and stiff from hours of traveling, toward the pile near the pillar. As she gets closer, she smells a sharp, rancid stench. Stations are places for squatters, for the poor. Closer, she makes out some figures on the platform. All sleeping, it seems. Flies buzz around them. Flies, black flies. Why are there so many flies? She stumbles over something small. She looks down. It's a hand, possibly a woman's, chopped off at the wrist, fingers cactused, clawing inward as if something has been ripped out of them. Around the pillar, bodies, a foot with a sock but no shoe, a head rolled a little away from the heap, a child's head, a face with its eyes gouged out, a woman, young, long-haired, staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. Her breasts are gone. In conclusion, the saga is not over. Whether empire has truly ended or not is a matter for controversy. But during International Women's Week, History Month 2021, and in post-election America 2021, I hope this account of women and the partition of India will serve as a reminder that the only people to make laws and draw lines should be those who represent the people and come from them. Thank you very much. And I welcome comments and suggestions. Goodbye.